Hello everyone, it's COD, King of Denominator here, and with the release of the new Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 2023, I've been thinking to myself lately, how many Call of Duties are there? They have to be like 100 by now, right? No, there are actually 51 and counting. So I told myself, with this many Call of Duties, is it possible to combine them all into one gigantic, cohesive timeline? With a little bit of research, I discovered, you know what? It probably is. Kinda, sorta. Now, as a youngster, I remember playing Big Red 1, as well as Finest Hour, but the original Modern Warfare trilogy really defined my childhood, as well as Black Ops. That being said, I know that they all, for the most part, reside in their own respected universes. However, like I said, after doing a little bit of research, I discovered that it is theoretically possible to put them all into one timeline, and here's what I came up with. Now, before I start, I know that there are comics, but I'm mainly going to focus on the video games and media related to the video games, as the comics don't really have as much as an impact on the chronology. They kinda do, just not a meaningful one for this video, in my opinion. Also, a little disclaimer, this video isn't really for the casual viewer. If you're not familiar with the Call of Duty games, I'm not going to go into much detail about each individual game. So if you're a Call of Duty aficionado, or just a person, that has some knowledge of the games or played them, then that shouldn't be much of a problem. The goal here at the end of the day is just to put 51 games in chronological order. Also, one more disclaimer. I am not going to include Nazi Zombies, Exo Zombies, Extinction, or any other spin-off Call of Duty title such as that in this chronology, even though Zombies kind of theoretically influences the timeline, but I am not going to go into very much detail, just base level where it's needed to fill in the blanks. Even so, I'm going to link a video in the description that covers that portion. Okay, now we're going to start the timeline off with what I will refer to as the original Call of Duty timeline, or the COD timeline, which is set during World War II. Keep in mind that the COD timeline is not in any particular chronological order. They are basically games that have a set series of campaigns based off of World War II battles, which don't actually align very accurately with their real-life counterparts, as the genre of the early titles, or hell, the game series as a whole, is mostly historical fiction. So without further ado, let's do this. The COD timeline starts off on August 10th, 1942, with the original Call of Duty and its expansions, United Offensive and Finest Hour. The next game is going to be Call of Duty 2. Now, this is a bit controversial, because some will argue that Call of Duty 2 is the actual first game of the timeline, because there's this character by the name of Captain Price, which we were first introduced to in Call of Duty, but was later on killed in that game. Now, this is true to a certain extent, but on the same note, it does not make sense, because we were reintroduced to Captain Price in Call of Duty 2, but since Call of Duty 2 was labeled as a direct sequel to Call of Duty, most will tell you that the character was simply retconned and reimagined, which, trust me, is going to be a common theme with this game series, so strap in. But the only way to amend this inconsistency is to place the Call of Duty 2 British North Africa campaign directly after the Call of Duty tutorial mission, which would make things sensical, as the events in that campaign occur prior to the events of the main Call of Duty campaign. But remember this guy, because there's a theory about him later on in the timeline that will affect where things go from here on out. Next, we have the Call of Duty 2 expansion / companion games. Then we have Call of Duty 3, and finally Call of Duty Roads to Victory. And this technically concludes the COD timeline. Kinda, sorta-ish. I'll explain later, but I reiterate, keep in mind that these games are a series of standalone campaigns loosely based upon World War II battles, and there may be some inconsistencies, inaccuracies, or contradictory dates, but these largely do not affect the overall timeline. And I know you're asking, well, where does Call of Duty World War II fit in all of this? And to that I say, We're gonna get to that, but not right now. Alright, let's move on to the Black Ops timeline. And this timeline begins at what I call the Black Ops deviation, which occurred on August 17, 1942, beginning with Call of Duty Cold at War and its companion games, Final Front, World at War Nintendo DS, and World at War Mobile. Keep in mind, these companion games are largely irrelevant to the Black Ops timeline. The only relation they share is the title. They can be considered standalone. This being said, they actually have more in common with the COD timeline, so for the sake of argument, we will place them in the COD timeline. Now, since we've established the beginning of the Black Ops timeline, let's push that aside for a second as it is super fucking long and convoluted, and go ahead and introduce the Modern Warfare timeline, or as I like to controversially refer to it as, the COD continuation timeline. This timeline begins with the game Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare in the year 1996 with the mission All Gillied Up. In this game, we are introduced to one of our protagonists of the Modern Warfare series, then Lieutenant John Price, who will later become a captain. Now, remember this Captain Price early on in the COD timeline? There is a theory that he is the grandfather of this Captain Price, roughly connecting the two timelines, hence why it's a dashed line instead of a solid one. Now, this theory is just that, a theory, with no supporting evidence whatsoever. But I don't know, man, I can see the family resemblance. Also, let's not forget the title of the game is literally Call of Duty 4, continuing the naming scheme of the COD timeline, just with a modern twist instead of the traditional World War II setting. Then again, we cannot go off of titles alone. As I've stated before, the World at War companions are not related at all to the Black Ops timeline, aside from the titles. But if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, well, you know the rest. Anyway, the next game of this timeline is the best Call of Duty ever made, fight me, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which takes place 5 years after the events of Modern Warfare, in the year 2016. Modern Warfare 2 has several companion games, these being Force Recon and Modern Warfare Mobilized. Now, there are several events that take place leading up to the main story of Modern Warfare 2, these being Operation Kingfish, which was an off-screen mission by Delta Force operatives to capture Makarov, who is the antagonist of this series. This mission was a failure and ultimately led to Captain Price being captured and taken as a POW and put in the Gulag. Next event is the Force Recon campaign, which takes place in 2014. Modern Warfare Mobilized takes place concurrently with the events of Modern Warfare 2, just in a different setting and with a different antagonist. Next game in the timeline is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 and its companion game Defiance. Defiance actually takes place prior to the events of the main story of Modern Warfare 3, but concurrently with the events of Modern Warfare 2, just a few days leading up to the ending mission where General Shepard is killed. And that concludes the COD continuation timeline, aka the Modern Warfare timeline. Kinda, sorta, ish. I'll explain later. Okay, so let's move on to our first deviation of the COD continuation timeline, which begins with the mission Shock and Awe from Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare on Day 3, 2011. If you played this game, you know what happens in this mission. Basically, Makarov sets off a nuke, which causes General Shepard to begin his villain arc. Alternatively, let's say that Shepard's arc did not happen, and the nuke did not have the desired effect that Makarov wanted. After the nuke went off, the Middle East began pointing fingers at whoever they felt was responsible, until tensions reached the boiling point. Eventually, they start shooting off missiles, which caused other countries to shoot missiles at them, nuking the Middle East until it is basically a giant wasteland of irradiated glass. This would lead to the events of our first and only game of this timeline called Call of Duty Ghost, which I am branding the Ghost Deviation and/or Ghost Timeline. So for a little bit of context behind Call of Duty Ghost, it takes place in an alternate timeline where the Middle East has been destroyed by nuclear hellfire. The game doesn't really specify why. I honestly just made up that scenario so it will fit into the chronology. And it makes sense if you ask me. Anyway, no Middle East means no cheap oil. Therefore, the oil-rich nations of the Southern Americas form a federation and so forth and so on. If you played the campaign, you pretty much know what happens next. But briefly, in the prologue mission Ghost Stories, on this day, the Federation hijacks a satellite that shoots space bullets, and they begin blasting the United States. 10 years later, the US is a wasteland, an invasion happens, more shooty gun stuff, then it ends on a cliffhanger at the end. Okay, so let's move on back to the COD continuation timeline. Remember how I said that the Modern Warfare Trilogy kind of ended it? Well, this is what I mean. I'm going to theoretically say that it did not end here, and that there was actually another game in this timeline that continues it. That game being Call of Duty Advanced Warfare. Now, hear me out. Advanced Warfare was initially intended to be another Modern Warfare game, because around the time that it was being developed, an unnamed Sledgehammer employee made comments stating he was responsible for developing photoreal visual effects for the next Call of Duty Modern Warfare release, back in the summer of 2013. However, this would not be the case, as it was not a new Modern Warfare release, or was it, but a new, different game entirely called Advanced Warfare, which was released the following year in 2014. I mean, take a look at the naming scheme. Instead of Modern Warfare, it's Advanced Warfare now, which makes sense because it takes place 37 years after the events of the Trilogy, even though it doesn't have any connection to it whatsoever. But a lot can happen in 37 years. I mean, Makarov is dead, Price is most definitely dead, unless he's like immortal or some shit. Everyone else is probably old, and all the teams like Task Force, Delta Force has probably been disbanded or absorbed into other organizations or militaries. But to give a brief summary on Advanced Warfare, you basically play as a soldier called Jack Mitchell, and you are recruited by this private military organization called Atlas to do some shooty gun stuff, and eventually you have to destroy Atlas as they are the bad guys now and save the world, the end. This being said, Advanced Warfare marks the end of the COD continuation timeline, correct? Almost. Our final game of the COD continuation timeline is Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. And I'm just going to be straight with you, the only connection this game has with any of the other previous games is the title. Whereas, instead of it being modern or advanced, it is now Infinite Warfare. The earliest events of Infinite Warfare take place nearly a century after the events of Advanced Warfare, this being the off-screen Secession Wars, which were fought in 2157, 30 years prior to the events of the main campaign. The main campaign of Infinite Warfare starts on May 6, 2187, and if you played the game, it's basically Halo meets Star Wars meets Call of Duty minus the aliens. There's also a companion game called Infinite Warfare Siege, that's set in the same universe, but it's irrelevant to the chronology as it is only a generic, insignificant mobile strategy game and nothing more. Moving on, so in reference to Call of Duty World War II, it wouldn't be right to put it in the COD timeline, so what I'm going to do is put it in its own timeline, but from the same point of origin, making it a deviation. Anyway, I think this video dragged on long enough, so what I'm going to do is make a part 2 that just completely encompasses the entire shit show that is the Black Ops timeline game chronology, because that needs a video within itself anyway. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.